Welcome everyone to Luohan webinar. Today we are very happy to have Professor Najib Ali. Najib Ali is a professor of economics at Penn State University. On top of that, he's also serving as a member of a board of editors at American Economic Review and an associate editor at Review of Economics and Statistics. Professor Ali is an economic theorist, and some of his research interests are in information and coalition. His papers were published at top economic journals such as American Economic Review, Quarterly Journal of Economics, and Review of Economic Studies. Today, Professor Ali is presenting his paper called Voluntary Disclosure and Personalized Pricing. So Professor Ali, the floor is yours. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for organizing this and for including this paper. It's a great pleasure to present this paper. This is a joint work with Greg Lewis and Shoshana Wasserman. And although this particular paper that I'm presenting is complete in the sense that it's forthcoming at the Review of Economic Studies, this is sort of an ongoing research agenda. So we'd be very happy to take your questions, take your ideas, and move forward with this. It's a sort of very exciting area to work in, and I'm very excited to share this work with you. Okay, so what are we doing in this paper? So we're sort of interested in understanding the sort of the role of consumer data and personalized pricing. So here's our sort of rough outlook of how we think about consumer data. So we think that there's a lot of consumer data obviously out there. Firms are possibly using this to assess consumers' willingness to pay, target particular customers for marketing campaigns, and offer them discounts. So, one of my co-authors, Greg Lewis, who's an avid hiker, this may be what his browser page looks like. He'll sort of see things advertising Patagonia as well as coupons to purchase things from Patagonia. Okay, so here's what we think possibly happens. So, there's my co-author, Greg Lewis. He is interacting with a number of different platforms. This could include places where he's buying things from, things that he's looking at on social media, Google searches that he's doing, and of course, his credit card company. Some of these platforms may be selling some data to some data aggregators or companies there who are sort of taking this data, packaging it, sending it to Patagonia, who then is able to send Greg a targeted offer, trying to get his attention and trying to get his business. Okay, so one of the things we're really interested in is thinking about, well, in this context where Greg is generating data, this data is being sold, and this is being used for personalized offers, how much control Greg should have over this data? And this is really the motivating question from this paper, is to understand the equilibrium implications, the market implications of consumer control. So, the focus on consumer control is something that we see both in the academic literature as well as public policy. So in a really nice survey on the economics of privacy, Christie, Taylor, and Wagman say privacy is not the opposite of sharing, rather it is control over sharing. And indeed, consumer control, as I said, is not also features in many public policy regulations. So for example, in the European Union GDPR, the data protection rules sort of really highlight the importance of giving consumers more control over their personal data. This is also something that we see in market settings where firms are providing consumers with an ability to have greater control. So this is a screenshot from when Apple allowed consumers to set whether they wanted an app to track them or not across other apps and websites. And this is a picture of Trevor Noah talking about this on The Daily Show, saying this is huge, that this is a big deal. So it seems to be the case that consumer control is sort of looming very heavily, both in academic and popular discourse. And our goal is to sort of try to model it, to try to understand what would it mean to have consumer control. And so here we envision an alternative data ecosystem, one in which Greg controls his data, sends a verifiable message to his firms that's verifiable in the sense that it relates to the data he has. The firm then responds with a personalized offer. As to where this data came from, it came from Greg's interactions with these platforms. But rather than the platforms being able to sell the data, we're envisioning an alternative ecosystem where Greg could control the data. The reason we're envisioning this alternative ecosystem is really just to make sense of the sort of the focus that's been on there in the in the last few years on consumer control. So we're really trying to model and understand what consumer control means and what its implications would be on markets.
Can I ask you some question?
Yeah, please.
I just wondered, do you know how prevalent this kind of the personalized pricing in a durable good? I heard about that this kind of the hotel or the airline experience good. I heard that they actually doing a lot, but this durable good actually, if they sell for the different prices, that can actually arbitrage between the consumers. So I also just wondered that, do you have any idea how prevalent it is in the industry?
Yeah, very good. So you know, it's one of the cases. It's to some degree there is some evidence to suggest its prevalence where people have sort of gone onto platforms with different identities, created identities to see if they get different prices. Now it's hard to know whether this is personalized pricing or whether this is some kind of random pricing. In other contexts, you might think about technologies that facilitate it. So there are insurance companies, car insurance companies that allow you to sort of put a device in your car that sort of sees how you drive over time and adjusts your insurance premium to how you drive. And this you could think of as both being a combination of personalized pricing as well as tackling moral hazard issues in insurance. Another example that comes to mind is, and this is something that's been prevalent in the US before the whole data ecosystem questions, which is if you have like these cards, like what are known as EBT cards that indicate that you receive benefits from the government, then you're able to buy goods for cheaper prices. You're able to get Amazon Prime membership at a lower rate, so on and so forth. Things that indicate that you have a lower willingness to pay because you just have lower income, oftentimes do create these sort of personalized discounts. So it does seem to be the case that there is some prevalence. Now, the fact that personalized pricing is so frowned upon by consumers means that it's actually quite hard to detect. So you know, there's this problem where, you know, I think the question you're asking is spot on. We're not entirely sure if it's happening, but happening in ways that are opaque and hard to detect, or not happening very much as perhaps theory might indicate.
And right now, it is not illegal to price discriminate again. It's like a personalized pricing, right? It's not illegal.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
It's not illegal, but it seems to be the case that whenever consumers can easily detect it, it's something that makes it to the New York Times or the Economist magazine, and then everyone gets upset about it. Interestingly, it seems to be something that really looms heavily in the minds of policymakers. And so that's part of the reason what that motivates us, is that there must be a reason policymakers are thinking about this and are thinking about consumer control. But,
okay, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, great. So what are we going to do in this paper? We're going to do a very simple, almost Econ 101 kind of exercise, which is we're just going to take a very simple model in which consumers can perfectly control their data. They can verifiably disclose evidence about their preferences in monopolistic and competitive markets. And we're going to ask, can consumers benefit from this combination of control over their data and personalized pricing relative to a benchmark of uniform pricing? So relative to the sort of, exactly as Sangu suggested, relative to a benchmark in which you sort of just prohibit personalized pricing, make it illegal. So that's the thought experiment, is can consumer control and personalized pricing actually benefit consumers relative to uniform pricing, not having any personalized pricing at all? Another way of asking this question is, can data be used to improve market efficiency without all of those additional surplus going to data owners, brokers, and firms? Can some of that surplus be given to consumers? Okay. And the reason that we found this sort of an interesting question theoretically is that we know from many game theoretic contexts that a firm might draw inferences about my preferences, not only on the basis of what I share with the firm, but what I choose not to share with the firm. If I'm hiding a lot of information about my preferences, the firm might then infer that, oh, if Najib is hiding a lot of information, he has something to hide, which tells the firm already something about Najib's preferences. So this classical intuition is, of course, modeled in the classical work by Grossman and Milgram on verifiable disclosure, where once you give people hard information that they can use to disclose information about their types, we have unraveling, where in equilibrium, the consumer feels compelled, or the agent feels compelled to disclose evidence about her type, and the firm, when it sees no evidence is being disclosed, takes a very skeptical stance. And in equilibrium, the consumers do not have any private information whatsoever. If firms could perfectly price discriminate, this would lead to there being no consumer surplus. So this is sort of a classical intuition that exists from the late 70s in the game theoretic literature about how verifiable disclosure could lead to unraveling. And our question was whether this happens within the model of markets we're going to study here. And so let me tell you about how we examined this question. What we're going to do in this paper is we're going to consider two different kinds of evidence. One kind of evidence is what we call simple evidence, where I can either reveal everything about myself to a firm, or I can reveal nothing at all. So this is a sort of a very stylized version of the track or do not track kind of dichotomy. If I allow a firm to track me, then it observes everything about me. If I do not allow the firm to track me, then it observes nothing about me. Okay, so this is a very stark dichotomy, and it's a way of one way of thinking about consumer control. A different way of thinking about consumer control is I can choose bins about myself. I can partially disclose information about my type without having to disclose it all. And this models some partial disclosure possibilities. So what this paper is going to do is it's like a 2x2. We're going to solve a 2x2 model where we're going to think about simple and rich evidence. And we're going to think about monopolistic markets and duopoly or oligopoly. So what we show is, so just give you a preview of our results, and then I'm just going to dive into an example, is that simple evidence is going to be completely ineffective against a monopolist. But against a monopolist, rich evidence can benefit consumers. And we're going to find a different force in competitive markets where both simple and rich evidence can help consumers in competitive markets with horizontally differentiated products. Now, you're going to see that each of these models is going to have multiple equilibria. And so, whether consumers actually benefit or not is going to depend upon how the market is designed. It's going to depend on equilibrium selection issues. Those are things that those are not things that we get into. Simply, our question is moreover whether consumers can benefit from this combination of consumer control and personalized pricing, whether we can find an equilibrium in which they find these benefits. Okay. So this summarizes essentially what we do. I'm happy to take some questions, and if not, I will just dive into the analysis and an example of the monopolies. All right, so let me dive in here. So we're going to look at a very classical, as I told you, this is sort of Econ 101 or like a version of this. In fact, one of the things that made this project so enjoyable for all three of us is that as we were writing it, we constantly felt that, this paper could have been written in the 80s. To the best of our knowledge, it wasn't written in the 80s. But as you'll see, we're sort of taking very classical tools in thinking about this problem. So we have a single consumer who we're call she has unit demand. She just demands one unit of the good, and her value for this good is V. And for simplicity, she interacts with a monopolist who incurs no cost of production. So introducing cost of production won't qualitatively change the analysis. So just for simplicity, we imagine that production is cost-free. And just for simplicity for the presentation, let's imagine that the consumer's value is drawn from the interval 0, 1 with a uniform distribution. And the consumer observes her value, the firm does not. Okay. So what happens in this classical problem? Well, this is once again just introductory micro. You know that the consumer purchases the product at a price only if her valuation exceeds the price. And so the firm can think about its demand curve, how much it's able to sell at a given price, as the quantity of, or the probability with which that sale happens. And then the firm is just going to maximize its profits, which in this case, it's just its revenue. And so the consumer, the firm optimal price is to simply charge a price of 1/2. And this leaves the consumer with some surplus. This is an important expression for us, which is what happens with uniform pricing. If her value exceeds 1/2, she skims that surplus. She obtains that sort of gap. And if her value is below 1/2, then she does not buy the good and obtains a surplus of 0, obtains her outside option. Okay, so this is what happens when we have no disclosure, sort of the very classical benchmark in this model. And what our interest is going to be to introduce disclosure into the setting. All right, so what are we going to do? So we take the static monopolist problem and we just augment it with a verifiable disclosure state. Let me define and describe the extensive form somewhat carefully and then go through the analysis. So the consumer, once again, is going to observe her value. And then she can send a verifiable message to the firm where the message she can send comes from a set that depends upon her true type. So different types might have different sets of messages available to them. I'm going to describe what these sets look like on the next slide. But this is really going to capture the core of hard information. We're going to really envision cases in which consumers of different types have different types of messages so that you can use some messages to distinguish one type from another. Okay. So once the consumer sends a message, the monopolist is going to observe the message and set a personalized price, a price that's based on that message. The consumer is then going to choose whether to buy the product at that price, and neither party can commit. We're going to just solve for perfect Bayesian equilibria in this game. Importantly, everyone is going to be sequentially rational. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about what these message sets look like. So as I said, we're sort of interested in a 2x2 sort of analysis where we vary between simple and rich evidence and between monopoly and competition. So what is simple evidence? Simple evidence is either, you can tell the truth and the whole truth, or nothing at all. So you can either send a fully revealing message. Type V can say, this is my valuation. My valuation is 0.6. I tell you my valuation is 0.6. And, or it can send a complete, like a completely uninformative message. Now notice the message 0.6 is available only to type 0.6. It's not available to type 0.7, not available to type 0.61. It's available only to type 0.6. So this is a fully revealing message. It can be sent only by that type. And also notice the message 01, interval 01, is a fully concealing message. This message can be sent by any type. And so this we think of as being, as I said, a very stylized model for the track, do not track dichotomy, captures an idea that the consumer can somehow certify what her type is. Okay. So that's the simple evidence model. The rich evidence model is one in which we want to allow for some partial disclosure possibilities, where you can reveal some information about your type without having to reveal it all. And this is in contrast to simple evidence. So the model we have for rich evidence is one in which if my type is 0.6, I can choose to reveal any interval in 0, 1 that contains my true type. So I could say if my type is 0.6, that my valuation is between 0.55 and 0.65. I could say it's between 0.4 and 0.8, but I cannot say that it's between 0.1 and 0.2. And so this sort of embodies sort of partial disclosure, and the geometry embodies an idea. So, you know, for presentation purposes, I'm talking about a one-dimensional setting here, but in a multi-dimensional setting, what we have in mind is that if two types have evidence in common, so does any intermediate type between them. Okay. So here you're speaking nothing but the truth, but you're not necessarily speaking the whole truth. Okay, let's just pause for a moment for questions. Okay. So let me first tell you, let's first dive into what are the equilibria for this game. So our first thought was, you know, we anticipated when writing this game that, you know, one would get unraveling as in the classical hard information literature. And indeed, there exists an equilibrium that resembles unraveling. So for both evidence structures, there exists a fully separating equilibrium where every type reveals itself. Let me just go into the details of the construction here. So suppose it's the case that on and off path, for every message M, whether you're in simple evidence or in rich evidence, a firm believes that the message is sent by the highest type that can send that message. So this is a highly skeptical kind of belief. And what the firm does is it charges a price equal to that valuation, equal to that highest type. Now, what's going to happen is that on path, a consumer is meant to reveal itself and obtain a payoff of 0. If the consumer chooses to deviate, the payoff is still going to be 0 for that consumer, because every other feasible message that consumer could send must have a weakly highest type that could have sent that message, which means it must induce a weakly higher price. So neither the consumer nor the firm has any incentives to deviate from this fully separating equilibrium. Yes, Josh.
Yeah, just a quick question. If couldn't I do better if I was revealing my actual type, and I, under the rich evidence structure, deviated to something that had my type at the lower end, or the upper end of the range? Isn't there an assumption here for this equilibrium that if there is an interval being revealed, the firm also chooses infers that it's the top range of the interval, the upper bound of the interval that is the true type? Is that part of the proof here?
Good. So this is part of the equilibrium. So this is not going to be the unique equilibrium, but there exists an equilibrium where the firm expects to see messages that are could only be sent by one type alone, on path. Any other message is off path, and what the firm ascribes is a belief that if it sees an off path message, say 0.2 to 0.6, that this must have been sent by type 0.6, and it's going to charge a price of 0.6. But indeed, your intuition is exactly right, that maybe where we could get some leverage is through whether those other kinds of messages are going to be sent on path and what could be done with them. That's right. Very good. So this is, in some ways, this equilibrium here is analogous to the equilibria we see in Grossman and Milgram in terms of their unraveling equilibria. But unlike their settings, this is not the unique equilibrium. And so let me tell you now about another equilibrium. So for both evidence structures, simple and rich, there exists a fully pooling equilibrium where no type reveals itself. Every type just sends the message 0, 1. After obtaining the message 0, 1, the monopolist charges a price of a half, which is its best response. After receiving any other message, the monopolist believes that the message is sent by the highest type that could send it. The monopolist is acting in a way that's sequentially rational. And let me just convince you that given this, the consumer has no incentive to deviate. If a consumer's valuation is above a half and it sends the message 0, 1, it gets charged a price of a half. If that consumer sends any other message, it's going to get charged a price that's weakly higher than its own value. So it's going to obtain a payoff of 0. Analogously, consumer types below a half also have no incentive to deviate. So this sort of just immediately highlights that we need not see unraveling. But here you might say verifiable disclosure is not helping the consumer. The consumer is no better off from verifiable disclosure and personalized pricing relative to the benchmark of uniform pricing. Yeah, Joshua.
Sorry, I missed that last part where if I have a valuation of, say, a quarter, and the monopolist is charging a half, under either regime, if I reveal my, if I reveal my value to be a quarter, I will get charged that.
That's right, exactly.
That's my own question.
Exactly. So verifiable disclosure isn't helping the consumer, and this is really going to be our question, which is, can we construct equilibria in which consumers benefit from the combination of verifiable disclosure and personalized pricing? So our first conclusion is that with simple evidence, the answer is no, and the answer is no in a very strong way. So let me, this claim is wordy, but let me highlight what the claim says. So what the claim says is that if we had simple evidence where you have this dichotomy, either I say everything about my type or I say nothing at all, then for every equilibrium and for every type, the consumer does no better than what it would do with uniform pricing. So no consumer type can ever benefit in any equilibrium relative to uniform pricing. The consumer sort of stuck there. Even though there are multiple equilibria, simple evidence is completely ineffectual. So one thing that we thought of as being some sort of an implied takeaway from this sort of result, obviously this is a theoretical result, but an implied takeaway is that this sort of focus on the track, do not track dichotomy would not benefit consumers in a monopolistic market. So this is the claim. Let me give you a simple argument for the claim. So consider any equilibrium, and suppose it's the case that in this equilibrium, I have some group of types, some consumer types that choose not to disclose, and let P and D denote the price that the monopolist charges after receiving the non-disclosure message, the message that doesn't disclose any information. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to graphically illustrate two straightforward observations. One observation is that high types are going to conceal if my value exceeds the non-disclosure price. I'm not going to be disclosing. And the second observation is then that the optimal non-disclosure price is going to always exceed 1/2. And so you can't ever do any better. So let me sort of illustrate this. So this is the first claim, that if we had an equilibrium, then any consumer whose valuation exceeds a non-disclosure price must be sending the non-disclosure message. And the reason is, so, I've got the types graphed from 0 to 1 here, and I've got some purported equilibrium in which types in this region are fully disclosing, types in this region are not fully disclosing, and they're receiving this non-disclosure price, and I'm not specifying what happens here. Okay. So now for this type here, by fully disclosing the type, the monopolist has all the bargaining power in this relationship. By fully disclosing, the monopolist is just going to charge a price of V. This consumer is getting a utility of 0. On the other hand, if it were to do a deviation and were to not disclose, it would receive a price of P and D. and it would be able to skim this surplus right here. So this tells you that this consumer, if we had an equilibrium in which the claim was violated, there would be a profitable deviation. Couldn't be an equilibrium. Okay, so that's the first observation, is that whenever we're thinking about who discloses, who reveals and who doesn't reveal, it must be the case that all the types above the non-disclosure price are choosing to reveal. And now, no matter what you do or how you build it, how you construct it, you can never get that non-disclosure price now to go below a half. One way of thinking about this from a very classical intuition is that we know that the profit maximizing price comes from where the marginal revenue curve is hitting marginal cost. Marginal cost is zero. The marginal revenue curve is never going to cross now below a half, given that all types above that non-disclosure price are concealing. So this sort of brings us to the first conclusion, that simple evidence can never benefit any consumer type in any equilibrium. And this idea really generalizes. I mean, I know I've shown this to you with a uniform distribution and a one-dimensional type space, but it's going to hold across distributions, hold across general type spaces. It's going to be a very general idea. Okay. So now the question is, can one do any better? And the answer is, with rich evidence, you can indeed do better. You're going to be able to create an interim Pareto improvement in which trade is going to occur with probability 1. So it's going to be fully efficient. No consumer type is going to be worse off relative to uniform pricing. And almost all consumer types in the range from 0 to 1/2 are going to be strictly better off. And construction of this sort of mirrors Zeno's paradox, which is, translated from what Aristotle might have said, that which is in locomotion must arrive at the halfway stage before it arrives at the goal. And indeed, this is going to be how we're going to construct our partition, which we call Zeno's partition. So here's how the construction looks. We're going to imagine that all types from whose value is strictly exceeds 1/2, between 1/2 and 1, are going to send a message 1/2 to 1. And no other consumer can send that message. Now, if I were in an in-person seminar, I often might pause for a moment and ask people, well, if you know that the types, we know that the optimal price, if you know the consumers from 0 to 1 is 1/2, what is the optimal price? If the only thing you knew was that the consumer's type was from 1/2 to 1, and then sometimes people lean towards, oh, maybe this is going to become 3/4, maybe this is going to be a different number. One of the magical or nice things about these kinds of markets is that a monopolist's optimal price still remains 1/2, because this is still where that marginal revenue curve is hitting marginal costs. So the consumers in this upper segment are going to say, we're in the upper segment, and the firm is going to price at the bottom of that segment. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we're going to truncate the distribution and say, okay, now what should we do for types between 0 and 1/2? Well, for all types whose value is strictly above 1/4 and weakly below 1/2, we're going to have them send a message 1/4 to 1/2. And the monopolist is again going to price right at the bottom of this, and serving that segment. And as you can see, we can just continue this, going down from an 1/8 to 1/4, a 16th to an 1/8, so on and so forth. We're going to have a partition with countably infinite members, where the firm is always pricing at the bottom. So this is going to be a partition. And what I'm going to try to convince you is that this is indeed an equilibrium of the game with rich evidence. Okay, so let me go into why this is an equilibrium. So by construction, so the firms, the fact that the monopolist is pricing at the bottom of each interval, this is sort of easy to see that we're sort of just constructing distributions under which pricing at the bottom is optimal. When the monopolist receives a message, say from 1/4 to 1/2, it believes that the consumer's type is uniform on that range, in which case this is the optimal price. The more interesting thing to see is, why doesn't a consumer deviate? Well, the trick we're going to play here is that if my type is somewhere here, I have one on-path message I can send, which is 1/2 to 1. I can't send any other on-path message because they don't include my true type. I can't say that my type is between 1/4 to 1/2. So if I send this on-path message, I get a price of 1/2. If I send an off-path message, then the monopolist is going to have skeptical beliefs, and I'm going to get a price that weakly exceeds my true type. So I'm going to, if I deviate, I'm going to get a payoff of 0. So I have no incentive to deviate. And so this assures that the consumers who are on the interior of these messages have no incentive to deviate. How about consumers who are sort of at the boundary of these two messages? Well, this is what explains this somewhat weird clopen business we have going on here. Why these things are open on one side, which is our equilibrium specifies that if I'm type 1/2, I could either send a message 1/4 to 1/2, or I could send a message 1/2 to 1. The equilibrium specifies I should send a message 1/4 to 1/2 because that results in the lower price. And so given that, these types also have no incentive to deviate. They're also sending their optimal message. And so the scheme is generating an equilibrium. Each type sends its favorite on-path message. For all but a measured 0 set of types, there's only one on-path message it could send. And the monopolist is pricing at the bottom of each interval. And off-path, the pricing is just done with the same kinds of skeptical beliefs we were thinking of earlier in the analysis. Okay, so this is an equilibrium. Of course, I should clarify that, multiple equilibria still remain in this game. There exists an equilibrium that is fully separating. That was somewhat the first claim. So you could still have full unraveling, but this does show that consumers can be made better off with this combination of voluntary disclosure and personalized pricing. One thing that my co-authors and I found very interesting to understand, we really grappled with this, is why don't we see unraveling, as in the classical hard information literature? And here's the critical difference. In most disclosure models, if a sender is interacting with a receiver, the sender's payoff is strictly monotone in the beliefs that it induces in the receiver. So that if I induce a higher belief in say a first order stochastic dominating sense and a lower belief, then I might have strict preferences between these two beliefs. One thing that's somewhat interesting about this very natural model of markets is that the monopolist charges the same price when she knows that the consumer's valuation is 1/2 with probability 1, as she would when she knows that the consumer's valuation is uniform between 1/2 to 1. And what this allows us to do is to pool types with type 1/2 without giving type 1/2 an incentive to separate. So it's really this sort of very simple observation that's allowing us to create these non-unraveling equilibria. This is indeed, again, why I really feel like this paper could have been, it's miraculous, amazing for us that this paper was not written in the 80s, but really this paper could have been written in the 80s. It's really combining what I learned in graduate school as somewhat Bulow pricing models with very simple models of hard evidence. Okay, cool. Let me tell you a little bit about the generality of this result. So this construction is going to generalize to arbitrary distributions. So the basic idea for this greedy algorithm is just proceed iteratively. You have the whole distribution. You identify the optimal posted price for that distribution. Then all types whose valuation exceeds that become the highest market segment. One truncates this distribution and repeats on the truncated distribution. And this is always going to generate an equilibrium, which creates a Pareto improvement. Improves the utility for all but measure 0 set of types, and has full efficiency. One question you might have is whether this is necessarily the best equilibrium from an ex-ante perspective for consumers. So I've highlighted that this is an interim Pareto efficient equilibrium. Now, from the perspective of consumer surplus, we show that it suffices to always look at equilibria that are efficient and partitional in the sense that you could take messages at face value. And if someone says my value is from point 2 to point 8, these are the only types we're sending those messages. But it need not be ex ante optimal. So in fact, whether it is ex ante optimal or not is something my co-authors struggled with for multiple years of this project, trying to sort of see whether it's the case. It is indeed ex ante optimal for the uniform distribution and for any distribution where the CDF has this kind of power shape. But we do have a counterexample in the paper for other distributions. And this counterexample took us years to find, but we do have one. One natural question is whether if you propose more structure on the distributions that's sort of weaker than the power distribution, and something, let's say, like log concavity, which is an assumption that's so common in this literature, whether the results would hold. And we think that's a good question. We don't have an answer to this. So sort of we view this. I'm reporting to you as I sort of view this as sort of partial progress my co-authors and I've made. We hope that there could be more progress in identifying exactly when this kind of construction would be ex ante optimal for consumers. Okay, cool. I'm in the, I'm not in the interest of sort of going on to more substantive material. I'm not sort of going to go through sort of the counterexample nor an argument of why this is ex ante optimal for the uniform. So I want to sort of move ahead and tell you a little bit about what happens with competition. Okay, so the punchline that came from the monopoly model is that simple evidence is completely ineffective. Rich evidence is necessary to get consumer gains. Now, one way of viewing that message from the monopoly model is that that's somewhat of a negative message insofar as you might think that this rich evidence structure is perhaps too rich for what we might envision markets to have. What we show is that when one is interested in competitive markets, there's a positive result, which is that simple evidence is going to suffice. So the key force, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the model that we show, is that what voluntary disclosure is going to do is going to help us amplify competitive forces and make consumers better off. And this is a complementary channel to those that we studied in the monopolist model. So what we're going to do is, in the paper, we study a competitive model with general number of firms, general product differentiation. But really for the talk, it's going to suffice to just think about Bertrand duopoly with horizontal differentiation. The reason you want to think about differentiation at all is that without differentiation, disclosure doesn't matter because then the firms would earn zero markup. So this is just standard Bertrand competition. So really, this is going to be an interesting question with horizontal differentiation. And I'm going to try to illustrate this for us. I should say something that's maybe useful in interpreting the paper is this is actually the model we started with, was Bertrand duopoly with horizontal differentiation. And this was the force we were interested in. And it was when writing up the paper, we thought, oh, we need to compare this against the monopolist benchmark. We assumed someone had written the monopolist benchmark and we would be comparing it against that paper. And it was only then that we discovered that even in the monopolist model, this hadn't been investigated in prior work. Okay, so here's the competitive model, a very, once again, a sort of Econ 101 version. We have two firms. Firm L is located at the point -1. Firm R is located at the point 1. We have a consumer who's located somewhere between them. And this consumer faces, for simplicity, linear transportation costs. So if it buys from firm R, it would face the transportation cost of its distance, 1 minus L. If it buys from firm L, it would face a transportation cost of 1 plus L. And what the firm is going to do is it's going to compare its value for buying this product versus its total cost from buying from firm L versus that from buying from firm R. And we're going to assume that the value for buying the product is sufficiently high that we don't have to worry about any consumer being excluded from the market. So for the analysis here, it's just going to be that the value is weekly greater than 2. Okay. So let me first tell you about the sort of the benchmark, which is what we solve in intermediate micro. If the location is drawn uniformly from -1 to 1, then in equilibrium, each of these firms is going to sort of find its optimal price, holding fixed the price charged by its opponent. And in equilibrium, each firm is going to charge a price of 2. And so the total cost incurred by type L, excuse me, is a cost of 2, plus, the minimum transportation cost it faces. Okay, so this is the sort of the usual thing that we have from intermediate micro, and this is going to be the benchmark for analysis. Now, what would happen? I'm not telling you yet about an equilibrium, but I want you to, this will help fix ideas. What would happen if there were unraveling? Well, if there were unraveling, if the consumer's location were disclosed or commonly known, then what must happen in equilibrium is that if the consumer is located closer to firm R, in equilibrium, the more distant firm, firm L, is going to charge a price of 0. Firm R is going to charge a price that makes the consumer just indifferent between buying for the two firms. And the consumer is going to break its tie in favor of firm R, in favor of the closer firm. And now the total cost incurred by a consumer type is the cost of buying from the distant firm at a price of 0. And this is indeed exactly where we're seeing that sort of unraveling here seems to us to be a force towards something that's good. It's creating some competition, especially for firms located in the middle, the firms that consumers that do not, sorry, not firms located in the middle, consumers located in the middle, consumers that do not have strong brand preferences are going to be able to benefit from this amplified market competition. Okay, so this is what this looks like. So if I thought about a consumer's location on the horizontal axis, the total equilibrium cost the consumer faces, the benchmark of no personalized pricing. In equilibrium, all these consumers are purchasing from one firm or another, but this is the sort of the equilibrium cost in the benchmark of uniform pricing. And we see that unraveling is benefiting consumers relative to that, okay? With the consumers at the endpoints just being just indifferent. Now, this is the fact that unraveling is benefiting all the consumers is a degeneracy of the uniform distribution. Outside of the uniform distribution, it could be the case that these points right here are actually strictly above. And so this doesn't satisfy our criterion or our desideratum of having a Pareto improvement for consumers. And so the question we're going to see is whether we can do this with simple evidence. And so now I'm going to start building a particular equilibrium and a particular game. So here's how we could do better with simple evidence. Let me define the game. So I observe my location, and with simple evidence, I can either disclose my location or say nothing at all. And what we're going to allow for is a model in which I can send different messages to different firms. And the idea this is going to capture is I can allow one firm to track me while not being forced to allow the other firm to track me while concealing my location. I think there was a question.
Oh, yes. I just have a simple question. Here, unraveling means that firms know the customer's location perfectly.
That's right.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
that's right. So here I wasn't, I was sort of going halfway to an equilibrium construction. I didn't tell you much about the extensive form, or the equilibrium was providing some intuition that here, let's think about what happens if the consumer's location were either disclosed or somehow commonly known. Now I'm actually going to build an equilibrium in which consumers are going to do better than with uniform pricing. Excellent. Okay. So critical to this construction is that the consumer can send two different messages to the two different firms, and each firm observes only the message that it receives. And what I'm going to have, this is an ocean of notation that no one wants to look at, but I'll show you a picture. What I'm going to have, the rough idea is going to be that the consumers are going to reveal I'm going to reveal my location to the firm that's more distant from me, so that I get extremely competitive prices from the distant firm. and I'm going to conceal my location from the firm that's closer to me if I'm sufficiently close. And that closer firm is going to realize in equilibrium that I'm close, but it has to compete against this distant firm. Okay, so here's what the construction of a picture sort of says 1,000 Greek characters. So here's what the equilibrium looks like. If I'm located between -1/2 and 1/2, I reveal my location to both firms, and now we would have intense sort of market competition for these types. If I'm closer to firm R, what I do is I reveal my location to the more distant firm. So I receive a price of 0 from that distant firm, and I conceal my location from the closer firm. In equilibrium, firm R is going to anticipate that the consumer must be located close to firm R. It anticipates that the consumer must be getting a price of 0 from firm L. And in equilibrium, the optimal price that the firm R would charge is one in which it would make type 1/2 just indifferent between revealing its location or not. And so then all of these types here that are closer to firm R can pool with type 1/2. The analogous sort of construction works on this end of the interval, where if I'm sufficiently close to firm L, I reveal my location to firm R, nothing to firm L, and indeed this is the type that's going to be made indifferent here. So it's just the same construction. So now if I plotted the same picture, how does the equilibrium cost look in this construction? So we have the no personalized pricing benchmark. And now you can see that every consumer is made strictly better off relative to no personalized pricing. All of these consumers here are able to pool with types -1/2. All of these here are able to pool with type 1/2. And in this range, the consumer is fully disclosing its location and benefiting from amplified market competition.
Yeah, I have one question.
Yeah.
So in that construction of the equilibrium, so assumption is that consumer knows actually which company they are closer to, right?
That's right.
So even though maybe, for example, in the random utility model, customer knows that exactly which firm he has more strong preference.
That's right. So here we don't have any informational challenges between there's no information challenge that the consumer faces. We could imagine if the consumer had some uncertainty about which firm is its preferred firm. And we just thought about all of this analysis in terms of its expected terms, in terms of which firm it expects to be better.
Okay.
And then it can reveal evidence that relates to the signal it has. All of this analysis would go through.
So he's always going to reveal to the firm he's less preferred.
Exactly. To try to get a very competitive price, because the distant firm is trying to poach this consumer's business.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So this is, of course, a construction using simple evidence. You could do better by using, doing the sort of using rich evidence and greedy construction. So this was the equilibrium cost we have with simple evidence. What you could, of course, do with rich evidence is you could have types from, say, 1 to 1/2 pooling with each other, types from -1 to -1/2 pooling with each other. Then you create another region of types of 1/2 to 1/4 pooling with each other, -1 to -1/4 pooling, so on and so forth. You're sort of getting Zeno's partition from the ends going towards the middle. And so one could do even better than we had before. Every type here is going to gain relative to both no personalized pricing and full unraveling. This allocation is going to be fully efficient. And once again, the extreme types benefit from pooling with interior types, and interior types just have no incentive to separate from them. So that's sort of at the core of this. Let me tell you a little bit about general results that exist outside of the uniform distribution. So we assume that the location is distributed symmetrically around 0 and has a log concave density. We do this for two reasons. The first is to just guarantee that the benchmark model of uniform pricing is one in which this has a pure strategy equilibrium, and that this pure strategy equilibrium is unique. So this sort of leverages the standard assumptions made by Kaplan and Nailbuff. Under these exact same conditions, we show that the simple evidence equilibrium that we constructed always does better than uniform pricing for every type. And since the rich evidence equilibrium does only even better than this, this is going to guarantee that we have our Pareto improvements. Even more general results that now lives in the supplementary appendix for the paper is that there's sort of nothing special about there being two firms either. You could have done this for n firms where each consumer's valuation for the products is an n-dimensional vector drawn from the n-dimensional Cartesian product of some interval. And the previous analysis applies, where we think of a consumer's two favorite firms and we treat her location as the gap between her valuation between these two favorite firms. And the paper extends all of our prior results to this general domain. Okay, so there's really nothing particularly special about two, and there was nothing special about uniform. We do need the log concavity assumption, both for existence in the benchmark model and to assure our results. Okay, so this sort of presents a perspective that if, as I said, as we're examining this 2 by 2 in the competitive model, in a competitive market, there's sort of much more reason to think that consumers can benefit from consumer control and voluntary disclosure. And this is not only true in the fact that simple evidence suffices, but this is also true in another sense that I'm going to outline now, which is even in a worst case scenario, you could say that consumers are better off through the combination of voluntary disclosure and personalized pricing than with uniform pricing. And so this is a sort of a very recent result that we have in the paper, is we show that no pure strategy equilibrium can result in payoffs below the unraveling equilibrium with competition. So this is in some ways the worst equilibrium. And even though consumers on the ends might be worse off, so it's not a Pareto improvement, we show that in terms of average payoff, this is still better than uniform prices in the benchmark game under the log concavity assumption. And so this once again also highlights that equilibrium coordination may be more vital against a monopolist than in a competitive setting with horizontal differentiation. Okay, so let me sort of conclude this. I know I'm ending ahead of schedule, and I hope no one will mind that. This paper is one of those papers that's the perfect timing for presenting. This paper is actually 60 minutes. One sort of gets through the key insights. So what have we shown in this paper? We've shown that personalized pricing can benefit consumers when consumers can control the flow of information. We sort of really are leveraging a simple observation that the price that a firm charges is not strictly monotone in its beliefs. Because it's not strictly monotone in its beliefs, extreme types do not have an incentive to separate themselves from the crowd. Okay. So partial disclosure possibilities, I've said, are essential for monopolistic markets, and do not track that would not suffice. But in competitive markets, simple evidence might suffice. One thing that we find sort of interesting in terms of the broader outlook is that the typical disclosure, the discussions in the literature of communication and personalized pricing often hint at a trade-off between product customization and price discrimination. That if I reveal more information about my preferences to a firm might be able to customize a product to my taste better, but it's going to charge me more. What our work hints at is that verifiable information can lead to consumer gains without any product customization. And separately, that there's a powerful competitive effect in being able to induce distant firms to charge low poaching prices so that one's home firm also reduces prices. I should sort of acknowledge some key papers within the literature that our paper sits on. So in particular, in terms of the competitive markets plus targeting, a lot of our insights leverage or our insights are related to those in a sort of classical paper by Thies and Vives, where they think about whether firms would like to learn consumers' location or not. And they sort of do highlight that once firms do know consumers' location, it leads to this extremely competitive pricing. The key difference between what we're doing and what was done in that important paper is that in their paper, firms are in some sense taking all the action. They're trying to think about whether they should try to learn about consumer preferences. Whereas in our paper, really the active agent is the consumer. Should the consumer disclose information about her preferences in order to induce competitive pricing? So those are some of the key differences. Of course, a lot of the underlying strategic logic is similar here. Okay. Yeah, Josh.
So you motivated the paper at the beginning by the comparison of users being given control of their data versus some sort of ability of the firms to infer that private data from consumers. For instance, I might actually be able to infer some data about you, not because you've revealed it, but because you have exhibited similar behavior to me, some of these sorts of things, or using artificial intelligence to get some prediction of someone's value. You might have in the paper, did you compare the outcomes where the firm is able to get, say, a partition for every consumer with this outcome or not? What the difference? Because I imagine if the firms are able to get a perfect price, a perfect willingness to pay disclosure, you get at least welfare efficiency because they can perfectly price discriminate. But right. I wonder if there are soft differences.
Absolutely. So one thing that we did do is somewhat motivated by thinking about, let's say, data externality issues. We envisioned what would happen if the firm is able to get some information about the consumer's location or the consumer type in a monopolist model. And what we do there is we show that if there is any residual uncertainty that the firm has, and the consumer knows, and so I'm just laying out our assumptions, and the consumer knows what it is that the firm knows about the consumer's type, then in some ways we can fold all of this into the prior distribution on the consumer's type and show that nevertheless the consumer could still benefit from the use of rich evidence. I guess the important feature is that it must be the case that the firm is always, based on the information it has, excluding some types from the market. And once the firm is excluding some types from the market, we can create these segmentations where the consumer furnishes some information that induces a price discount. And so we do that comparison as well. Of course, if the firm has complete information, then there's no scope for any gains on the consumer side. One thing that we abstract from, so another branch of this literature that I wanted to connect us to was, of course, there is a sort of a really rich literature going back many years, starting from Curtis Taylor's work, on dynamic choices, where the key question is, if I know that a firm is going to be observing my choices, how should I distort my choices today in order to induce future discounts? And one way of looking at what our analysis is doing is it's giving a way for consumers to manipulate a firm's belief about its location without having to keep in mind these sorts of dynamic choices, by giving it the technology to communicate directly to the firm, rather than the firm having to infer things about the consumer's type from these choices. Of course, our paper fits into more recent literature on disclosure games and information design, and this is in some ways a burgeoning literature, so I'm not going to tell you more about some of the key papers here. Okay, so that's really all I have, and happy to talk more and take any further questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. And are there any questions about the presentation? the topic. Yeah, if there's no, maybe I just want to make, I just have one quick thought, maybe not relevant, but if you look at these days how consumers control their data, they're not, I guess most of cases they are, when they're managing their data is mostly with the platform. For example, I'm not deciding to give my data to iPhone. I'm not deciding to give my data to Samsung, the Galaxy phone, but I'm maybe deciding to give the data to Amazon, and Amazon is going to decide whether he's going to sell the data or something like that. So in that case, can I understand this kind of the, I don't know, equilibrium as kind of the platform, some privacy strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, here we're giving full control to the consumer on which firms get to see it, but you could imagine that the platform is doing this on behalf of the consumer. And this is indeed something that you could imagine. Let's say my credit card company observes the degree to which I travel, and maybe observes the degree to which I rent cars from certain car rental companies. And what my credit card company could do is it could sort of generate personalized offers to me from other car rental companies that says, look, Najib seems to be a frequent traveler and has been renting a lot of cars from these other companies, not from you. And then you could imagine a credit card company being able to attract consumers as well on the basis of its ability to generate personalized offers. So this would be one way of thinking about it. Now, of course, one distinction between us and perhaps a platform doing this is critical to our analysis has been that the consumer cannot commit, that we're looking at sequentially rational behavior at every stage. You might imagine that a platform can commit, that it bundles in some types who might have been better off doing something else differently. But by bundling in these types, it's sort of be able to generate greater price discounts. And so you could imagine that a platform could do even better than what we're doing because of its ability to commit. And so I think therein would lie a critical distinction.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Okay, yeah, thank you. And yeah, just one more check, and there's no question anymore. Yeah, if there's no, yeah, thank you very much for the wonderful talk, Professor Ali. And I also want to say thank you to the audience. Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening and logging in from all over the world.
Mm-hmm.